DOGE.
DOGE! DOGE! DOGE. It's DOGE. Hey there, friends, fans, and foes of Dad Saves America. John Papola here. And here we are with the beginning of a new era, a new world of politics, a new set of opportunities to try to explore the way our government actually works. So let's start with the new agency whose name is a meme, the DOGE.
President-elect Donald Trump announced a bold new initiative Tuesday night, appointing billionaire Elon Musk and biotech entrepreneur Vivek Ramaswamy to lead a Department of Government Efficiency. The duo, known for their disruptive approaches, will work outside the government alongside the Trump White House and its Office of Management and Budget to streamline federal agencies and slash wasteful spending.
So what is possible with the DOGE? Is it possible to actually come in and radically reduce the size and scope of the government in this way? And how should we think about reasonable expectations? Because the one thing we won't get out of a Trump presidency is reasonable expectation setting. In fact, if you look at the announcement, as we all know, and is not really newsworthy, there's all kinds of fun stuff here. We've got, I don't know why government bureaucracy, why the B gets capitalized, but of course Elon is the great Elon Musk. American patriot, capital A, capital P, Vivek Ramaswamy, so we're going to get bombast, and I think we as adults, if we want to understand our system of government, if we want to explain it to our kids, first, we got to understand it ourselves. But second, we actually have to move past the schoolhouse rock understanding of our government, because we have this thing that the DOGE is really aimed at. It is the administrative state, the bureaucracy, with a capital B for big. And it is largely unaccountable in ways that our founders understood accountability in a democracy, in a democratic republic, a country ruled by laws and ruled by a structure that's designed to constrain it. So what are they up against in the federal bureaucracy? How many people, how many departments, how many heads? How many heads are on the chopping block in theory? Well, let's take a look. As you can see, we got a lot of people in a lot of departments. The Department of Health and Human Services, which is the biggest share of spending, $880 billion of our federal budget is in health and human services. That's Medicare, Medicaid, and the various other health-related services. 88,000 employees, created in 1953. The Department of Defense obviously has the biggest head count because it includes all of the military. But there you go. There's a lot of heads to cut there. And actually, as we've heard from President Trump, he doesn't want to cut heads. He wants to rebuild the military. And I put that in scare quotes because I don't really know whether it needs to be rebuilt or not. We're certainly spending a lot of money on our military. And yet we hear this desire to rebuild it, like we're constantly rebuilding it. The Department of Labor, 14,000 people. The Department of Agriculture, 84,000 people, $134 billion. Department of Veterans Affairs, of the Interior, 56,000 people. Department of Transportation, 53,000 people. Any one of these would be a massive, major corporation. The budgets here are astounding. These would be Fortune 100 companies each. And having worked in a big corporation, Viacom, I can tell you that there's always a lot of places to tighten the belt in a big organization. Some of that is just straight up waste. Some of it is necessary slack to try to figure out how to adapt to a changing world. The problem with our federal government, and this is, I think, the greatest hope for the DOGE, frankly, and even for the kind of odd nature of what this is, to have essentially Elon Musk be advising from the outside while also being a military contractor, which is weird and kind of corrupt. But nonetheless, they're basically acting like outside consultants. That's the best model for what this seems like the best version of this could be. They're coming in and asking, in theory, the questions that you would expect. What do you do and why? And if they do a pretty good job of that, there could be some useful things to come from it. We have a lot of rules and regs and a lot of people whose job it is to mess with us and tell us what to do and how to do it across every single dimension. Let me give you a personal example, just one. There's a department called the Consumer Product Safety Commission, and its job, ostensibly, is to make sure that consumer products are safe. In the mid-2000s, a series of toys with lead paint on them caused a big scare. And so the Consumer Product Safety Commission decided we're going to tighten our grip on how painted products for kids get produced. This turned out to be a catastrophe for the natural products industries, the people producing wooden blocks or clothing, stuff that doesn't have lead paint, or that where the lead paint, even if there is some lead paint, is on the interior of a thing and is irrelevant. Was there spending involved in forcing entire industries to change the way they produce their products? No, not by the federal government. But they were inducing massive costs on we the people. And in many cases, those costs hit small businesses the hardest. So Mattel, who of course lobbied for these changes, also got a special exemption and an ability to test their own products in their own self-made facilities. Why do I even know about this? I know about this because my wife and I were trying to start a business producing cloth diapers, which is a super crunchy granola thing that sounds like, weirdo lefty nonsense, but they're actually quite great. And it turns out that we were subject to these rules and regs, and they were onerous, and it almost made doing it impossible. Nobody's eating cloth diapers, number one, and there's no opportunity to apply lead paint to cloth diapers. And yet Mattel, billion-dollar corporation, could absorb the costs and have the legal team, while we, small business trying to help, basically crunchy homeschool moms do things a little different, we get screwed. Those are the people that Elon and Vivek should go around saying, you're fired. And there are massive costs they induce on our society that firing them will eliminate. I am for that. I hope they do it. I hope they do a good job. And we would all be better off. Talk to anybody in agriculture. They'll give you stories that are far more dramatic about the Bureau of Land Management or the USDA or the FDA. These agencies make everything we do more expensive. Everything. So that's the good part. Another good part, my favorite part, is that there's things that aren't so much about dollars and cents, but they're about even more important aspects of our lives, like the way we get to educate our kids and how our schools work. And so one of the biggest opportunities is for Donald Trump and the DOGE and the entire movement that is now taking over DC to slash and burn that stuff to the ground.
And one other thing I'll be doing very early in the administration is closing up the Department of Education in Washington, D.C., and sending all education and education work and needs back to the states. We want them to run the education of our children because they'll do a much better job of it. Yep. You can't do worse. We spend more money per pupil by 3 times than any other nation, and yet we're absolutely at the bottom. We're one of the worst. So you can't do worse. We're going to end education coming out of Washington, D.C. We're going to close it up, all those buildings all over the place, and you have people that in many cases hate our children. We're going to send it all back to the states.
Do they hate our children? I'm not sure they hate our children. Do they have ideas that I find abhorrent and that I despise? Yes. Yes, they do. You might disagree. That's okay. But that's why we shouldn't have one size fits all. That's why we shouldn't have Donald Trump or the next president of the United States be in charge of how our schools are run. I should be able to put my kids in the school of my choice, and you should be able to put your kids in the school of your choice. The Department of Education is an example of where slashing these institutions couldn't be more important, regardless of the cost. And they do spend a bunch of money. It's something like $80 billion a year. So I think those are good opportunities. Those are things we should be cheering for. They will face enormous obstacles. And that's one of the other reasons why I think this is a challenging and interesting problem of our politics that the founders, with the separation of powers, didn't anticipate. To go back to Civics 101, the fundamental concept of the structure of our federal government, to have an executive branch, a judicial branch, and a legislative branch, be separated, and even the legislature to be separated into the Senate and the Congress, was to pit power-seeking politicians and want-to-be tyrants against each other, in the theory that that would be something like market competition. It would look something like, not perfectly, Walmart and Amazon trying to kill each other for our benefit. The problem is that over time, the Congress has decided that its job is to pass laws with lovely sounding names that basically tell the president and the executive branch that he oversees to make this or that great. That is basically what our laws are. Make healthcare more affordable. Make housing cheaper. Reduce inflation by spending a bunch of money on stuff that has nothing to do with inflation. That is what our laws largely are. They defer to these agencies, who then actually have, weirdly, an entire structure of lawmaking called regulations, and even justice making through what's called administrative courts. This is the fourth branch of government, and it is not subject to any of the ideas that try to constrain the state that our founding fathers intended. It is the most tyrannical regime within the bowels of our government, and it is a fantastic thing that we are finally talking about this for real. But I want to get back to why I think we suddenly are talking about this. But before I do, I want to talk about the thing that, frankly, we aren't going to see. And that is cutting the actual budget in any substantial way. So you see all that headcount, all those departments, you can slash them all to the ground, and you're still going to be left with a giant gaping hole in the budget. And the reason why is simple if you look at where the government actually spends all of our money. So here is usgovernmentspending.com, which is an ugly looking website, but actually has some of the easier ways to look at this looking backwards. For the year that just technically closed, 2024 fiscal year, federal government, most of the spending is in areas that none of this kind of regulatory DOGE style assault will touch. Pensions and healthcare are roughly half of all federal spending. Another giant chunk, which isn't shown here, it's put under remainder, is actually just the interest on the debt, which would constitute a default if we stopped paying. So that's kind of baked into the cake. Unless we want to basically induce a nightmare financial crisis, the federal government's going to keep paying its debts. And then the military, which is actually a much smaller share of our total budget than anyone realizes. This is where all the spending is. It's all in the entitlements, interest, and the military. All the other stuff is almost a rounding error. It's less than a quarter of the total government spending. It's called the discretionary part of the budget, but that's a bunch of nonsense. It's all discretionary. At any time, the Congress can pass laws that change your Social Security benefits or the way Medicare and Medicaid work. It is all at the discretion of the democratic process, our Congress and the president. So it's not for lack of trying. Or should I say, the trying we've seen hasn't cut it. One of the things that gets in the way of us understanding what's going on is that Washington, D.C. people seem to believe that reducing the rate of growth is the same thing as cuts. We saw this in the past couple of years from President Biden.
Folks, in just 20 months since I've been in office, we've cut the deficit in half. And that's not all. In my first 2 years, all this stuff, guess what? I cut the deficit $1.7 trillion. Cut the debt $1.7 trillion.
This is So the deficit went down because all the COVID spending stopped the temporary spending. So this happens every time. There's some giant crazy thing that goes on. They spend a ton of money that wasn't anticipated. And then when they stop spending the temporary money, they take credit for cutting the deficit. The deficit kept growing under the past 4 years. If you look at the line. In fact, when you look at the growth of the federal debt, it is the stuff of nightmares. Or I should say, it should be the stuff of nightmares if you care about the long-run health of the United States. But people around the world keep buying our treasury bonds. And until they stop doing that, we will continue doing this. Here is the growth of the debt. The money borrowed, spent, and now owed by future taxpayers. Not by the government, by we the people in the future. You can see basically in the 70s, the deficit was tiny, even as a share of GDP. And it began to grow a bit in the 80s. There is this one moment in the late 90s where we actually really did have the deficit go negative. We actually ran a surplus and began paying down the debt. It is the one time in my adult life that this has happened. It is in the late 1990s. And I want to take us in the time machine for a little bit there because we might not live to see this ever happen again in our lifetimes. And we certainly won't see it in the next 4 years, I'm sorry to say.
We come here today, Democrats and Republicans, Congress and President, Americans of goodwill from all points of view and all walks of life, to celebrate a true milestone for our nation.
That slowly, over time, we listen to the will of the American people, that we reach beyond parties, we reach beyond institutions, and we find ways to get things done.
And then here they are, signing a balanced budget. That ain't happening again anytime soon. We're not seeing that in the next 4 years, the next 8 years, the next 16 years. It's not going to happen. And the reason why is because the underlying things driving our debt are things that are popular. And they're going to be difficult and perhaps painful to confront if and when the money eventually runs out. This has happened in other countries, in Canada, in the Scandinavian countries, in Australia and New Zealand. We've actually seen governments shrink. Governments can shrink, but they need outside forces to force them to do it. Politicians won't dramatically shrink themselves. They won't cut spending that is incredibly, incredibly popular. Frankly, a political question for the ages. How did this happen? I have my own theory, and my theory goes something like this. Number one, because the Republicans are more small government, at least in rhetoric, when they are in the minority, they act like it. They want to constrain their competitor, the Democrat. And so what you had with Bill Clinton in the late 90s and the Republican House, which was actually the first time the Republicans had taken the House of Representatives in like decades. It might have even been the first time since World War II. They felt that they could and should stick it to Bill. And the way they could do that was rein in his purse and exert that power. And it was consistent with the rhetoric. Whereas the Democrats don't claim that. The Democrats claim that they're going to make investments and that, big government can work for us. I disagree with that. I agree with the Republican rhetoric, if not record more broadly. But that was number one. So it seems like, although there's not that many data points, that the optimal setup for actually shrinking government spending is a Democrat president and a Republican Congress and Senate. We've had that a couple times. Post-2010 Obama was similar, although we didn't get close to a balanced budget, but it did shrink, relatively speaking. It grew by a slower degree. The other piece, which is harder, is that the late 90s was the immediate aftermath of the collapse of the Soviet Union. The Berlin Wall had fallen. The Soviets were done. Bill Clinton was part of a coalition that called itself the New Democrats. And they were embracing capitalism and free enterprise and smaller government. In a separate clip, Bill Clinton said, "The era of big government is over." You couldn't say that as a Democrat today, but in the late 90s, in the aftermath of the fall of the Berlin Wall, and maybe to some extent the post-Reagan culture of the 80s and 90s, you could. That was, I think, a cultural force that made this possible. And this brings me back around to the DOGE and the reason why I think there's at least some reason for optimism here. And it's a little bit of a bank shot. And that is that these regulatory agencies have become so weird and so wacky and so absolutely assaultive of we the people that attacking them on those grounds is reason enough to shut them down. The Department of Education and the craziness we've seen in our schools has pissed enough of us off that shutting it down might actually happen. It'll still take an act of Congress. Trump can't just wave his pen and shut the thing down. But it might. There's a chance. There's a little chance. The woke wacky times has created a moment that I think might, at the margin, shrink the scope of government. And I hope it does, because as government grows, our scope as individuals to act shrinks. They take our money. They take the scope of things we can do without getting their permission. And so I think that this is the dynamic that's going on. It is a far more complex kind of politics than what we are taught about in school. And the rhetoric that surrounds it still isn't especially honest. So if you want to understand what's possible, if you want to understand what we face as a country, I think you have to go back to basics, but also keep tethered to reality. And I think that's a great place to stop. I hope this was helpful for you. I don't mean to rain on people's parade here, but let's be honest. We got to be realists. We've got to understand what the nature of the challenges America faces and how to understand them for ourselves so that we can teach them to our kids. Because obviously we didn't get taught this stuff in school, and our kids aren't getting taught it in school either. No thanks to the Department of Education. So I hope this helps you help your family understand the challenges that lie ahead. And I look forward to hearing from you in the comments below. And have a great weekend.